In a secret base buried deep within the Nevada desert, a pilot climbs into a jet, unlike anything ever built on American soil. The controls were alien, scattered with no apparent logic, covered in strange foreign letters. No ordinary pilot could ever decipher the maze of dials and switches. Yet somehow, the man in the cockpit knows exactly what to touch, twist, and ignite to send the machine surging skyward at an impossible rate of 45,000 feet per minute. A formation of supersonic Northrop T-38 Talons scramble to intercept, but as they close in, the mysterious aircraft begins to shapeshift midair. Its wings sweep backward, transforming it into a delta-wing predator, slicing through the sky at twice the speed of sound. The Talons close in, but the jet ahead breaks away. The chase is over before it begins, leaving the pilots trying to figure out how on earth they'll ever beat an enemy they can't even catch. It was early 1956 when a formation of American B-47 Stratojets pushed through the ice fog, choking the skies, and began their slow descent over the frozen fields of northern Soviet territory. From high above, the reconnaissance aircraft's cameras captured sharp images of towns and military installations covered in snow. This was Project Home Run, a campaign that, over the course of several months, launched more than 100 sorties to gather every ounce of intelligence possible on the enemy's defenses. The Soviets soon realized what was happening, but they couldn't stop it. Despite local aircraft patrolling the region, American crews later reported there was never a single close intercept. By the time the operation was over, the U.S. Air Force felt confident enough to take its espionage one step further. Only weeks after Home Run ended, a new and far more advanced bird slipped into the skies over the Soviet Union. This was the brand new Lockheed U-2, soaring more than 70,000 feet above the Earth, high enough to evade pursuit, and close enough to capture crystal-clear photographs of submarine bases and experimental aircraft deep within Soviet territory. The U-2s even ventured as far as Moscow, taking snapshots of the Soviet capital and infuriating local leaders who could barely track the intruders on their radar screens. Dozens of MiG-15s and MiG-17s were sent to try and stop them. There were so many that in some U-2 photographs, their silhouettes streak across the frames, making it difficult to identify the targets on the ground the Americans were trying to capture. Yet no matter how many Soviet fighters climbed to meet them, or how many shells filled the air, the Americans remained untouchable. For the Kremlin, it was pure humiliation, and now the Soviet leadership faced an impossible dilemma. They couldn't publicly admit that the Americans had violated their airspace with impunity, yet they also couldn't allow foreign spy planes to roam freely above their cities. In response, they demanded the creation of a new kind of aircraft, an interceptor that could bridge the gap between speed and agility. The answer seemed to come in the form of the MiG-21, a delta-wing fighter, capable of reaching Mach 2 with ease, thanks to its lightweight frame of just under 20,000 pounds. Although armed with a 23mm Gryazev-Shupanov autocannon, firing up to 200 rounds a minute, the MiG-21's true lethality came from its hardpoints, which mounted the most advanced Soviet munitions of the era. Among them were the S-24 rocket, whose proximity fuse unleashed devastating airbursts that could shred enemy formations, and the K-13, a Mach 2.5 heat-seeking missile able to track and destroy its target, even in poor visibility. But even with all its speed and firepower, the MiG-21 wasn't perfect. Its range was short, limiting mission flexibility, and it still relied heavily on ground radar guidance, a fatal weakness in a war that demanded total autonomy and split-second decision-making. If the Soviet Union were to create the ultimate guardian of its skies, it would need to take everything that made the MiG-21 great and push it further. By the 1960s, the Soviets were at a technological disadvantage, and no matter how hard they tried to upgrade their aerial fleet, their aircraft designs were rapidly falling behind their American counterparts. Engineers were nowhere near creating a model as advanced as the American U-2. Their best attempts still couldn't come close to the spy plane service ceiling, and the rudimentary camera systems made any attempt at carrying out effective reconnaissance missions almost impossible. For years, the Soviets simply had no efficient way to fight back against these sky intruders, forcing officials to rely primarily on surface-to-air missiles and early radar networks to track incoming aircraft and guide suboptimal aerial defenders to fend them off. To make matters worse, the Soviets knew that even the limited protection these desperate defenses provided would not be enough to keep the nation safe for long, as the Americans were already preparing to unveil yet another surreal creation, one that would make the U-2 look like child's play. The North American X-15 had its first flight in the summer of 1959, and from the moment it took the runway, it was clear this machine was unlike anything America had built before. The X-15 was an experimental model, capable of brushing the edge of space at over 100,000 feet while approaching Mach 7. Although there were no immediate plans for this model to enter active military service, the Soviets knew they could not afford to keep lagging behind. Luckily for them, a breakthrough would soon arrive, not in Soviet factories, but over the skies of Vietnam. The war was already burning across the jungles of Southeast Asia when American fighters began streaking across the battered terrains of Vietnam. The Soviet Union was not officially part of the conflict, yet its intelligence network and unrelenting support for North Vietnam's forces gave it a front row seat, from which Soviet officials could finally get a close look at the United States' most advanced creations. Among them was the F-4 Phantom II, a technological marvel equipped with radar so powerful it could track and lock onto targets below it, even against the noise of the ground, giving pilots, for the first time, the ability to look and shoot down at their enemies. And when those pilots pulled the trigger, they hit hard. Capable of carrying almost 19,000 pounds of ordnance, the Phantom could unleash anything from heat-seeking missiles to nuclear payloads, capable of obliterating entire formations in the blink of an eye. Soviet engineers knew this was precisely the kind of power, range, and avionics their nation needed to reclaim control of the skies. They began dissecting every detail they could gather on the Phantom, seeking to adapt its concepts into the next evolution of the MiG-21. The American influence wouldn't end with the Phantom. Over the same Vietnamese battlefields, another predator prowled the skies, a supersonic warrior, unlike anything the Soviets had ever encountered. The General Dynamics F-111 Aardvark was a machine out of the future. It could fly at Mach 2.5 and cover 3,700 miles of terrain. But most intriguingly, it featured variable sweep wings, a concept that would change aeronautics forever. For decades, engineers had experimented with fixed-wing shapes, straight for lift, swept for speed. But the F-111 sought to become the first aircraft capable of doing it all. The result almost seemed made up. At low speeds or heavy loads, the Aardvark's wings extended wide for lift and stability. When it was time to strike, they folded back, transforming the jet into a high-speed spear. Though highly experimental, the Soviets saw limitless potential in the Aardvark's design and were determined to master the same variable geometry system. It would take some time before they could perfect this technology and pair it with the ambitions inspired by the Phantom II. But when they finally did, they were certain their efforts would bring Soviet air power into a whole new era. July 9th, 1967, was a special day in Moscow. The nation was celebrating 50 years since the revolution that had freed it from the Tsar's regime. To mark the occasion, one of the most spectacular air shows in Soviet history was set to take place at Domodedovo Airport in the nation's capital. As officials and civilians gathered, skies became crowded with dozens of the USSR's most powerful fighters. It was a breathtaking display, the nation's top pilots ordering their aircraft into intricate maneuvers at sound-breaking speeds. Then, as the aerial demonstration continued, a peculiar aircraft broke through the formation. It wasn't a model anyone on the ground could immediately recognize. Its silhouette resembled the MiG-21, yet its longer fuselage and straighter lines evoked the shape of the American Phantom II, while its nose bore an uncanny resemblance to the F-111 Aardvark. But what truly set this mysterious new aircraft apart were its swing wings, panels that in a single motion shifted position and gave the aircraft an entirely new shape. The MiG-23 had finally taken to the skies over the Soviet Union. Despite the complexity of its design, engineers at McCoy and Grigevich had managed to get the aircraft airborne just 2 years after initial specifications were approved. By 1970, the MiG-23 would be officially introduced into the ranks of the Soviet Air Forces. The Americans took notice immediately. They assigned it the NATO reporting name Flogger and watched closely as the aircraft entered mass production in the years that followed. While the MiG-23 had clearly drawn inspiration from U.S. models, the final version had its own identity. Unlike the dual-engine, two-seat configurations of the Phantom II and Aardvark, the MiG-23 was a single-seat, single-engine fighter. It was smaller than its American counterparts, yet it could still give them a run for their money at its astonishingly fast velocity. Powered by the Termansky R-35 F-300 turbojet, it could reach a speed of Mach 2.35, making it one of the fastest Soviet aircraft the U.S. had ever faced. With the introduction of the MiG-23, engineers had also delivered on their promise to equip the Soviet Air Forces with a model featuring a powerful new radar system, capable of locking onto targets from virtually any angle, even those beyond visual range, as the jet carried advanced missiles able to travel up to 25 miles, detect their targets, and destroy them in a single strike. For close-quarters combat, the MiG-23 packed 7 hardpoints, supporting up to 4,400 pounds of ordnance, along with an automatic cannon capable of unleashing hundreds of rounds before an enemy even realized it was under fire. By all accounts, it was the aircraft the Soviets had long been waiting for. But as pilots began to climb into the cockpit and take the MiG-23 into the air, they soon realized that for all its impressive capabilities, something wasn't quite right. One of the first things MiG-23 pilots noticed was just how low they sat in the cockpit of the jet, their line of sight barely level with the aircraft's front and side windows. That might not have been a major issue on its own, but the moment the canopy closed, their already narrow view was cut even further, leaving only the front-facing window as their main way to see the battlefield. In an aircraft whose high-mounted wings already reduced visibility, this became a serious problem. Aware of this limitation, engineers attempted to incorporate a periscope system into the jet, giving pilots at least a minimal way to spot enemies sneaking up from behind. However, pilots who would go on to fly the jet later described the feature as almost useless. Nothing more than a tiny mirror mounted above the pilot's head, which they had to glance at constantly while flying at over 700 miles per hour. By all accounts, it was a near impossible task, one which American test pilot John Mann later criticized by stating, quote, "If you can imagine driving your car by using a very small part of your rear-view mirror, that's what it would be like." With weak visibility, pilots would have to rely on the aircraft's top speed for survival. However, although the variable geometry wings gave the MiG-23 the theoretical ability to outrun most opponents, mastering their complex mechanics proved a serious challenge for pilots who were already struggling to perform basic tasks due to the cluttered and unreliable cockpit system. Simple indicators, like oil and fuel gauges, weren't actually connected to the tanks. Instead, they worked as manual pointers, which pilots had to set themselves before takeoff. These only showed estimated reserves, leaving pilots virtually blind in the event that fuel was being lost at a faster rate than expected. And that was always a very real possibility. The Termansky R-35 F-300 turbojet, while incredibly powerful and capable of matching America's finest aircraft in speed, was also notoriously fuel-hungry, cutting the MiG-23's range down to around 1,600 miles, roughly half of what the F-111 Aardvark could cover. And fuel wasn't even the only engine problem pilots had to deal with. The Termansky model was simply too unreliable and had a very short life, often refusing to reach full thrust and leaving pilots helpless targets in the middle of the sky. However, even when the engine did respond, the flight wasn't smooth sailing. At top speed, the MiG-23's swept-wing design was supposed to enhance maneuverability, but instead, pilots often lost control. The aircraft could suddenly roll or yaw uncontrollably, making clean turns nearly impossible. Any dream of becoming a dogfighting champion was quickly shattered. Because of these shortcomings, Soviet officials refused to retire the MiG-21 outright. Instead, they continued flying the older interceptor alongside the MiG-23, pairing the two in hopes that the new fighter might eventually fulfill its potential. But as the Flogger began to be exported abroad to Warsaw Pact allies and Soviet-friendly nations across the world, it became painfully clear to Moscow's leadership that the jet they had once hailed as the ultimate guardian of their skies would never fly as high as they had hoped. When the first MiG-23s arrived in Syria in 1974, the local Air Force quickly realized they would have a hard time in their fight against Israel. The jet's radar systems, although theoretically advanced, proved vulnerable to jamming. Their attack capabilities were barely standard, and more than a dozen jets had to be scrapped shortly after delivery due to system failures. Still, the MiG-23 remained among the best options the Soviets and their allies had to counter Western threats in the 1970s. Despite its flaws, the aircraft would be deployed, and one way or another, pilots would have to find a way to win the battle using them. Their lives depended on it. It was mid-April when Captain Al-Masri took off from his base aboard a MiG-23. He hadn't been sent on a combat mission, but rather on a standard flight to test that the weapons of his jet were working properly. However, the moment he spotted a formation of Israeli F-4 Phantoms in the distance, he knew this would not be a test anymore. Al-Masri needed to gain the upper hand. Before the Phantoms had a chance to strike, Al-Masri pulled the trigger. In the blink of an eye, 3 missiles shot from the MiG-23's hardpoints, streaking toward the Israeli formation. The opposing pilots scattered in every direction, but the missiles did not relinquish their pursuit. One slammed into an F-4 before it could escape, sending the aircraft spinning toward the desert below as fire and smoke trailed behind. The second Phantom fared no better. Just as its engines roared into the afterburner, another missile found its mark, tearing the enemy aircraft apart midair. Only one F-4 Phantom managed to outrun the Soviet missiles, fleeing the scene at top speed before the remaining missile could find it. But Al-Masri wasn't done yet. Spotting another F-4 entering the area, he armed his cannon and closed in. The enemy was just within range, close enough for his shells to rip clean through its fuselage. Even before firing, Al-Masri could already taste victory. The mighty Phantom, the aircraft that had served as the inspiration for the very jet he was flying, was about to meet its ultimate defeat. His finger tightened on the trigger, but before he could fire, a missile from the ground found him first. The MiG-23 spiraled out of control, flames erupting from its engine as the F-4 escaped unscathed. The brief triumph of the Soviet jet was over in seconds. Sadly for the Soviets, this would become the norm when conducting missions on board their newest jet. And as research fellow from the Quincy Institute's Eurasia program, Mark Episcopos stated, quote, "There's no ambiguity here. The MiG-23 boasts a long, well-documented, and deeply embarrassing service record. The full extent of its failures is too great to recount in detail." The MiG-23 would have a chance to redeem itself in the 1980s, as Soviet aerial forces began deploying the jet to the front lines of the Soviet-Afghan War. Its first combat use came in April 1982, when a group of floggers was assigned to escort a formation of attack helicopters targeting enemy positions in Nimruz province, near the borders of Iran and Pakistan. It was meant to be a quick and precise strike, but almost as soon as the formation began its descent, the Soviet pilots spotted a group of Iranian F-4 Phantoms closing in fast. The moment the MiGs broke formation and unleashed their rockets and cannon fire, the Phantom slipped effortlessly between their strikes, weaving through the sky before banking hard toward the exposed helicopters. Within moments, the air was filled with fire, as several Soviet gunships were torn apart before they could even launch their payloads. By the end of the mission, the ground was filled with burning wreckage. The MiG-23 pilots, unable to protect their comrades or retaliate effectively, were forced to withdraw. Reports showcased just how fragile the jets became throughout the decade, with the MiG-23 suffering an average accident rate of 12.5 losses per 100,000 flight hours under Soviet command, and as high as 24 per 100,000 among its Warsaw Pact allies. Desperate to salvage their fighter's reputation, engineers at McCoy and Gurevich worked tirelessly to correct its flaws. It would take costly battlefield losses and setbacks, but eventually, the aerospace firm was able to deliver a far more refined model, the MiG-23 MLD, NATO codename Flogger K. This final version introduced a new radar and missile suite, as well as enhanced aerodynamics that finally gave Soviet pilots a fighting chance against Western aircraft. An onboard flight computer automatically adjusted the variable sweep wings mid-flight, optimizing lift and speed, without the need for constant pilot input. Not every flaw of the original MiG-23 was erased, but the transformation was undeniable, and as the first MLDs roared off Soviet runways, the long-troubled Flogger finally began to show what it was truly capable of doing. By the late 1980s, a flock of Flogger Ks sliced through the sky at top speed. Their noses bore shark-mouth insignias, snarling through the clouds like bloodthirsty predators as they closed in on a pack of younger jets. The pilots ahead never saw it coming. Within seconds, they were surrounded, MiG-23 barrels locked on them from every direction. There was no way out. Luckily for them, this was only a test run. The Flogger K had become the quintessential aggressor aircraft in the Soviet Union's own version of Top Gun, an elite series of training missions where young pilots learned to survive dogfights against skilled airmen. Cadets were handed some of the most advanced aircraft the Soviet Union could field, including the brand new MiG-29, already undergoing trials to become the nation's next-generation fighter. But even with these cutting-edge machines, the students often found themselves outmatched by the seasoned Soviet veterans flying the MiG-23 MLD. Even the Americans took notice. The Flogger might not have lived up to becoming the scourge of the skies it had once been poised to be, but if Soviet pilots continued refining their tactics, it was only a matter of time before Western air superiority faced a real challenge. The US forces knew it had to find a way to counter the Soviet MiGs, and the only way to do that was to fly them themselves. Even before the more advanced MiG-23 models began to roll off factory lines, the US had already launched a top-secret initiative known as Project Constant Peg. Through covert deals and intelligence operations, American officials managed to secure various MiG aircraft and ship them home, where they became the crown jewels of a hidden unit, the 4477th Test and Evaluation Squadron, better known as the Red Eagles. Operating from a remote base in the Nevada desert, these elite pilots flew the Soviet jets in countless simulated dogfights, training more than 6,000 Air Force, Navy, and Marine aviators to recognize and neutralize every tactic, weapon, and weakness their Eastern counterparts might use. It's believed that at least a dozen MiG-23s found their way to American soil. About whether the Red Eagles used early interceptor models or the more advanced MLDs, the group immediately became the nation's foremost experts on the Flogger. Pilots from all across the country would travel to their secret base for week-long MiG hunting masterclasses, studying every nuance of the aircraft, its strengths, its flaws, and the precise moment to strike. Former Red Eagle pilot John Mann recalled years after the program was discontinued, quote, "During our training, Day 1, Air Force, Navy pilots, they might have trouble against these airplanes. By Friday, we didn't want to come to work because they were going to hand it to us." Because of the Constant Peg program, American pilots ensured that no matter how capable the Soviets became with their newest Flogger variants, the US would always be ready to bring them down if the situation ever called for it. However, by the early 1990s, it was becoming clear that the Americans wouldn't need to fight to topple the Soviet Union, as the nation was doing a fine job of destroying itself. And along with it, the Flogger's last chance at ruling the skies. As the Soviet Union dissolved, Russia's air arm began a painful contraction and restructure that gradually pulled the MiG-23 from frontline duty, with the last variant retiring in 1998. The Flogger never quite fulfilled its promise of becoming the ultimate guardian of Soviet airspace. Still, by the time its production run ended, the Flogger program had managed to build over 5,000 airframes and sustain a long global career. Even today, a handful of allies keep limited numbers of MiG-23s flying, though not without trouble. Sudanese, Ethiopian, and Libyan examples have suffered fatal crashes in recent years during both testing and combat missions, keeping the troublesome legacy of the MiG-23 well alive, nearly 60 years into its service. With the MiG-23's slow fade, the MiG-29 stepped forward as Russia's principal fighter aircraft. Designed with the Flogger's lessons in mind, it traded brute speed for agility, married better avionics to a pilot-friendly cockpit, and restored confidence with twin-engine redundancy. It also fixed the Flogger's claustrophobic sightlines, swapping them for a cleaner cockpit layout and far better situational awareness, helping it mature into a capable multi-role platform whose production and upgrades continued into the late 2010s. Yet by the time the last MiG-29 rolled out, only about 1,600 had been built, barely a third of the MiG-23s. The Flogger remains one of the most legendary models ever created by McCoy and Grievich, even when carrying along a questionable reputation.